actually have anything to do with things? And that is the question that all of you want to know. And the other question you want to have an answer to is, how many minutes do I have before I lost my students? And so I'll lose the interest of about half of you right now by saying that it's not so simple, because there are different types of attention. And as you know yourself, you don't want just any type of attention. And it's not about students periodically paying attention to what we're saying. We want their attention 100% of the time. And so how many of you are focused 100% on what I'm saying? Some of you finally settled in and are about to have your lunch. Others are frantically trying to ignore the emails that are coming in. In Julie's case, she's furtively looking at the clock to make sure I'm not talking too long. And so what we have really is divided attention. And we all instinctively know that really divided attention is not as helpful at helping us remember information and keeping us engaged. And so the brain is constantly having to decide what to pay attention to and what you can safely ignore. So think back to when you just moved into a new place. I'm pretty sure that for, at the very least, the first week, you couldn't sleep well. You kept waking up to all the different noises around you. So maybe it was the gathering in the park outside that you weren't expecting. Maybe it's the running of the elevator. Maybe it's the elderly upstairs who can't sleep and is walking around with a walker. Or maybe there wasn't even anything specific. Maybe it was just like the creaking of the house as it's settling in for the night. Maybe it's a slamming door here and there. But your brain didn't know which parts were important, which ones that you should actually be paying attention to, and what you can safely ignore. And so that yelling from 5A is the mother of 4 exasperated children, and it's not child abuse. And maybe that creaking is just the settling of the house and not the house falling apart. But your brain still had to decide which of this information was important to pay attention to and which it is that you can ignore. So the same thing happens to us all the time in all situations and in the classroom as well. Where students need to know that they can ignore the buzzing of the light and the whispering in the back, and that there's nothing startling or valuable happening there. And they can ignore the buzzing of the phone because it's not their phone, and so on and so forth. So during COVID, we lost some of that know-how. We lost that ability to ignore some things. And now we are having to learn those things again, including us instructors who are having to relearn that not every student reaction is important. Not every student reaction is one that we need to riff off of, and that sometimes you say something and somebody reacts, and that's okay. You can just keep going. So none of this is what you're here to ask about. What you want to know is sustained attention, focused attention. But before we get to how long have we got, with our students, before they start thinking about other things, we need to understand how attention works. And so I haven't really touched upon this, but I can't continue this conversation without talking about recognition. And so the underlying idea, the underlying assumption of attention is that there has been recognition of the stimulus. So the registering of the input, meaning the brain has processed what has been said or shown, recognized what that input is, without regard to general context. So you're not so engaged in your sandwich that you haven't heard me talk at all. You've heard maybe that I was saying, but maybe you just weren't paying attention to it so much. So this registering of an input is known as bottom-up processing. And this begins with information processing at a very basic, very stimulus level until it builds up and reaches the more sophisticated regions of the brain. So for example, what letter is this? You can type in chat, if you can speak up, whichever. Okay, perfect. I'm getting a range of responses already. Some think it's an H, some think it's an A. So this is the very basic processing of a stimulus. And this is relevant in the case of studying, because sometimes what students do is very much bottom-up processing, right? They're not necessarily fully engaging in the context. But simply because it's there, they think that they are just going to absorb information through osmosis. And so the other way that we process information is through top-up processing. And so the middle letter of each word, you will notice, is identical to the first letter that I showed you. And so this letter could be an H or it could be an A, but the way for you to know that is through the context within which you are looking. And so here you need to engage top-down processing, because what you need to be able to do is look at the concept, expectations, and the memory to register the meaning. And so you know that the combination of the T and the E is not really going to be T-A-E, hey, it's going to be that. And so you quickly gloss over that and you quickly can keep going into the processing of the rest of that sentence, despite the fact that this letter is written in exactly the same way. Here's another example of these different types of processing. So imagine you're standing on a platform, you're waiting for a train, you know that there's a train coming, you're expecting that much. That's your higher order cognition at work. But beyond that, when the train is pulling into the station, you don't necessarily have an expectation of what that train is. So for example, you're standing at the 59th Street station, there's either the N or the R pulling in. Ignore those helpful announcement boards that they recently installed that may or may not work half the time. But to figure out which train it is, you literally need to look at the signage. You literally need to look at which letter is written on the train. And so the stimulus travels from the retina, it gets transmitted to your occipital lobe, to the back of your head, there's recognition, there's memory, all of these different things get pulled in order for you to recognize. But the initial bottom-up processing of that is literally you looking at the signage and seeing what that signage is. Now, top-down processing is when you're standing on a platform which only has the 6th train. So let's say 68th Street. And you're aware that the 6 stops there. So when the train pulls in, you're not thinking about which train it is. You just walk into the train, right? And so you don't have to think about, oh, is this going to be the 6? Is this going to be the 8? Is this going to be the Q? You don't have to think about any of that. You just walk in. And so at the point when you realize that you walked into the wrong train because there were train changes or whatever, that's your top-down processing getting activated. You're having to pull in, oh, what happened? How did I get here? Why am I in this particular train as opposed to the one that I was expecting? So now, by a show of hands, how many of you saw something wrong in the title of my presentation? And so here's what some of you may have seen that I purposefully, in this case, left out a letter. And so the reason that many of you didn't notice it is because top-down processing works, or we think it works, by encoding information about the likelihood of seeing certain items in specific environments. And so researchers have long thought that in reading, other factors than just the literal stimulus coming in is what allows us to process information, what allows us to process words. And it's not about analyzing the features of words. And considering the speed with which we read and process information generally, it just would be too much workload if we were looking at every single feature. I need a volunteer who's going to read something for us. It's a very brief example. So who wants to be my guinea pig?
I can do it.
Okay, thank you. So what I'm going to ask you to do is read what you see on the next slide. Out loud.
I can replace every, Valerie, you promised this wasn't hard. Every something latex of a sentence with an X, and something still can manage to read it with the same something.
Very close, very close. I can replace every third letter of a sentence with an X, and you still can manage to read it if with some difficulty. So considering that I gave you no context for this, you had no practice for this, you were still able to puzzle out half of this. And so with some difficulty. And so if we were to analyze every feature of every letter, we would need to process about 5,000 features every minute. And in a number of studies over the years, we've shown that in fact process letters a lot quicker than that, especially if they're meaningful rather than nonsense words. So this explains why you had no problems with the man ran in the earlier slides. And so the point of top-down processing is that it allows you to take hints from the environment, make sense of what is written, without necessarily having everything correct in all the different places. And so knowing the context of the stimulus allows us to better ignore or better attend to the stimulus, meaning if I know the topic, I can ignore it completely, as our next presenters are probably doing because they know this stuff. Or if I don't know it, but I know enough about it, then I can tell that this is the part that I've been having trouble with. And so this is where I need to make more meaningful connections. And so this is where I need to pay attention to it more. And so having the top-down processing involved helps us tie the information together into the different things that we already know, so that new information and the significance of that information makes sense in the context that stands out as something, oh, this is something that, that adds to the information that I already know and am trying to learn. And so now that you know about the background processes, we can talk a little more head-on about attention. And so attention is a concentration of mental activity, which allows one to take a limited portion of a vast stream of information available to us from both the sensory world and from our memory. And therefore, in this sense, attention is the gatekeeper to learning, which is probably why you're all here. And so both top-down and bottom-up processes are important. It might be because an instructor telling students this will be on the exam perks everybody up, as we know it does. And that's the bottom-up processing, where literally that stimulus is telling them, hey, pay attention to this, this is important. Or it might be top-down processing that tells a student that this particular topic that they don't understand from a home reading is the one that you're talking about, or we're talking about in the class. And so we should pay attention to it so we can clarify it, so we can understand it. But the thing to remember is that we cannot pay attention to everything. And if we're paying attention to something, that is always at the cost of something else. If I'm paying attention to the topic and catching up with my notes from a topic that the instructor just finished, I literally cannot listen and hear and process at the same time them starting on a new topic. And so those introductory statements that we're making to accentuate the importance of a new topic that we're starting, those are going to be lost if the students are just settling into the class, if they just come in and they're still trying to get themselves settled. It's not like they come in to the classroom and immediately they're ready to pay attention to us. They're not. They still need that moment where they can set everything aside and say, okay, now I'm here. And so there are a number of different types of attention, as I mentioned briefly. And one that we don't want is divided attention. And so that's where a student pays attention to you, but also to their phone or to the whispered conversation behind them. But what we might want is selective attention. And that's where a student specifically focuses on some things, ignoring others. Ideally, the ones that they're focusing on are the things that we think are important and are talking about. And so, as I mentioned, there are a number of different types of attention. In a divided attention task, you try to pay attention to 2 or more simultaneous messages at the same time and responding appropriately to each one. In many cases, both the speed and the accuracy will suffer. And so you can walk down the street, have a conversation on the phone, chew gum, while also look around at the crossroads. And the reason for that is because you're using different types of modalities to process information. But if you're texting, you're going to slow down because you cannot text and look at where you're going and get there safely at the same time, because those use the same processing methods. And so students think that what they're doing is multitasking. And as a society, we tell them that that's what we value. We tell them that that's what's important. Look at any job ad. In reality, however, research doesn't support this illusion, and we typically perform faster and more accurately if we focus on one task at a time. Task switching is very closely related to multitasking, because every time you transition to the same task that you just took a pause from, you need to pick up the thread of where you were. And so there are more errors during these transitions. It takes a longer time for you to finish the task. Think about you're writing an email to a student, and an email from the chair came in big block letters. It says urgent. By the time you get back to that student email, even if it turns out this urgent email wasn't for you, you've already lost the thread of where you were going, what you needed to say, etc. Focused attention is very methodical. It's not actually what we want for our students, despite the fact that we think we do, because focused attention it doesn't allow for creativity. It doesn't allow for students to make connections. And so while we have the idea that we want is focus, the type that we get when we're writing a lecture or a presentation 30 minutes prior to the start of it, because we procrastinated for a week, right? So that type of focus is very difficult actually in the classroom and not really what we want. Selective attention instead is the one that I personally think we should aim for, because it requires people to pay attention to some information, ignore other information, but this is the type of attention that allows students to make connections. Focused attention is very slow, it's very serial. So if you are searching for it's kind of like searching for a needle in a haystack, right? Like you're literally having to look at every single thing, one by one by one. You can't just let your eyes roam. And so focused attention takes a lot of time. And so that is another downside of having that in the classroom, despite the fact that we think that's what we want. And so really selective attention is the one that allows us to hopefully engage our students, let them do the thing that we need them to do, take notes and whatnot. But at the same time, be able to switch when we want them to switch, still be able to answer questions and so on. And selective attention is more automatic than focused attention. Focused attention has to be forced. I believe I've talked for long enough. And so I'll let my colleagues pick up where I'm leaving off and talk about, now that we know about attention, talk about how to get students to selectively pay attention to you, how to choose to pay attention to you. Thanks, Al.
Hi, I'm Michelle Lask. I'm the fieldwork coordinator of clinical placements for the counseling program. We have 3 tracks. We have mental health counseling, school counseling, and rehab counseling. And I'm here to really hopefully help Valerie's presentation kind of jump off the page in terms of practice. I'm going to start with the end of Valerie's presentation because she was right on. I was having difficulty attending in the beginning because I was like, I go next, and I was distracted. But honestly, it was so interesting. I actually got out of myself and got into Valerie's presentation. And so very, very much related to how Gina started us off this morning, in that we have so many distractions, if you will, in terms of, or as Valerie alludes to, competing priorities, that, you know, we have our internal distractions and we have our external distractions. And although we really can only control for so much, it really starts with, or it can start with, noticing within ourselves what tends to be barriers to our attention, or, you know, from more of a counseling perspective, effective listening. And so an internal distraction can be nervousness about presenting, fatigue, hunger. And an external distraction can be noise, you know, as Valerie related to, like, in city living, vertical living, as someone explained this to me, like we we get very comfortable or used to noises that we hear all the time. And we're very sensitive as soon as we hear something that it's not necessarily louder, it's just different. And it is amazing how much we take in, and we can attend to difference, which actually can be more distracting in our day-to-day. And so it's really about, in this day and age, we hear a lot about being mindful, but really, what does that mean? And it starts with noticing within ourselves, and how do we attend to ourselves so that we can then be open to being in service to others. So, for example, teach from, let's say, 7 to 11, and then we have lunch break. And 10:30, what starts to happen? Sandwich, coffee. Oh, I have to do laundry. We start getting distracted because we start getting hungry or tired. And the truth is, as much as we start to take ourselves out of the experience, we are expected to stay in the experience until 11 o'clock or until our break. So it starts with noticing, and I can't stress this enough. It starts with noticing and being curious, as opposed to being self-conscious or as opposed to being defensive. We are human, and we are only expected to be human. And we have different rhythms and tolerances, and it just makes it interesting. It's interesting. And so if we know that we have the bandwidth of 2.5 hours, but we're expected to be on for 3, well, do we have cold water with us, and take that out at 11:30? Anything to keep us, quote, in the room for that last half hour that we're expected to be present. So a lot of this has to do with self-reflection in terms of what do we notice within ourselves. I think that it really starts there. Another thing we can do is, again, always in the spirit of being curious as opposed to self-conscious or defensive. And sometimes we have to, kind of compete with ourselves in that way. But that, how are we feeding off the energy in the room? So, for example, as a counselor, again, I am human, and heart of hearts, there are some clients I prefer working with more than others, and that's just my stuff. It's not a judgment, it's just my stuff. And there are going to be some classes that you look forward to more than others. It just makes us human. And so in the spirit of being curious, we can ask ourselves, what am I feeding off of, and what are they feeding off of? And maybe, how do we open up the conversation in terms of, like, it feels a little harder in here today. Like, why is it harder to get started? So again, we're about to go on break. It might be high energy this week. When we come back, it might be a little low energy. I teach a class. I work with interns for the entire year. It's lovely. And as much as they're excited to graduate the program after spring recess, sometimes it's so hard for them. Like, they're like, oh my God, it's so close yet so far. And I could choose to take it personally, but I'm not going to. It's just human nature. Sometimes the closer we get, the harder it is. And this is true for a lot of different situations. So I had the pleasure of working with a colleague in my previous job. She planned on retiring. And as much as she looked forward to it, the last 6 months were so difficult because it couldn't come soon enough. And I think sometimes when we're looking forward to things, we get distracted, in terms of how it affects the energy. And so it really is about self-reflection, understanding us, picking up and opening it up to the people we work with. And so, and if if anyone knows me for more than 5 minutes, they'll know like I'm a pretty impatient person. So sometimes I have to hold myself back in service to the group. So for example, if I'm, as a clinician, if I'm running a group and I'm like, oh, they're talking too much. And I'm like, that's a private thought. I am looking around the room to pick up on the members like, oh, they're still interested. I'm holding back. Or if they're kind of checking out, again, I'm feeding off on the energy in the room, the eye contact, the body language. And so when do I know to kind of refocus, shift, invite other people in? So oftentimes what helps us stay mindful, present, attentive is by using the energy in the room, the people in the room to inform us about what our next steps are. It helps us be spontaneous. It helps us be less controlling because we certainly want to be prepared, but we also want to allow for the environment, if you will, to be a living and breathing thing. So the one thing I'm going to share again, it's just a little bit of a cheat sheet, sometimes helping us know what our barriers to listening are, help us stay focused. And sometimes I teach my students that sometimes the best part of preparing is that we know it and then we can let it go so we can actually be more attentive. So we always know we have it on the back burner. So again, and this might be true for you, might be true for your students, barriers to effective listening, comparing. So, that we might, and again, the more vulnerable we're feeling, the more insecure, the more sometimes we want something. There are more barriers because we want to prove ourselves. So comparing, thinking how you measure up. So if you're new at a job or it's a new class, you might be so distracted. How am I doing? How am I doing? Mind reading, making an assumption about what others are saying. Again, we're no longer focusing on what's being said. We're distracted by what's going to be said. And more often than not, we're inaccurate. Rehearsing. This goes on a lot, I think, especially with students. They're so, again, I'm that insecure student. Like, I don't want to say something stupid. So like, so we don't want to ask a stupid question, or we don't want to sound stupid, that we're so busy rehearsing what to say that we actually stop listening and paying attention. Again, these are all versions of, what Valerie talked about in terms of competing priorities, filtering, listening to some things, not others. So, and then I'll ask my students, what do we tend to listen to? We tend to listen to things that we agree with, that don't hurt our ears. So how do we dig down and listen for things that are different? On the macro, on the micro, judging. So again, this is really focusing on the messenger, not the message. So again, another form of how do we embrace difference and be curious. Daydreaming. So again, sandwich, laundry, grocery. So again, and we might start daydreaming more when we're tired, hungry, whatever. Again, and really, oftentimes it's like noticing so that we could tell ourselves to stop and get back in the room emotionally. Over-identifying. This could be taking things personally, or we stop listening because, oh, the same thing happened to me. And so just a little, what I often encourage my students is think in terms of it's similar, not the same. Because when we focus on same, we actually stop listening. We always want to remember our story is not their story is not our story. It's similar, which is empathic. Same is actually unempathic in a way. Advising, again, this is like we hear a few things and then we know how to cure it or fix it. And when we're focusing on fixing, we stop listening. Sparring, again, playing devil's advocate. I teach my students, like, as soon as it comes out of your mouth or in your thought process, let me play devil's advocate. I'm like, okay, that's the time to stop because it's hardly ever useful. Being right, again, again, we know we're doing this, as it was taught to me. What does yes, but mean? No. Yes, but. And then derailing, suddenly changing the subject. And why do we typically change the subject? Because we disagree, or we disagree, or something we're no longer curious. So again, it's really just about being. It really starts with us. We all get distracted. There's just so much we can attend to, but how do we prepare to do our best so that, and then feed off the energy in the room? Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Josh Friedman. I'm a PhD student at Teachers College, and I am an adjunct faculty member teaching in the psychology department here at Hunter. And I just want to throw it out there as I've been set up wonderfully. I've been teed up fantastically by our first two presenters. I think Valerie did a really wonderful job of thinking sort of cognitively, like, what is attention and how do we understand this sort of attention versus that sort of attention? And Michelle really spoke to this sort of like, what is the emotional experience of being attentive and being attentive to our students and being attentive to ourselves and what we need. And both with like incredible quick lists. I'm going to try to like keep those things in mind. I'm going to try to keep those themes going, like move into a like, for lack of a better kind of like chopping up category, move into a motivational domain, sort of like, how do we motivate ourselves and others to attend in some sense? And so what does that look like for us? What does that look like in the classroom? What I'm going to present today comes from a recent paper in the Frontiers of Higher Ed. If anybody's interested, it goes much more in depth of these ideas. But to put it out quite simply, I think about these things in terms of balance, and balance being this thing that exists between us and the world, where we have this circle of balance. We have this area, this sphere that like we're comfortable in and we're balanced in. And when we get unbalanced, we are like attending to like, what's going on? What do I not understand? I'm a little bit uncomfortable. When I get too imbalanced, when I get sort of outside of this slight level of discomfort, I might be in what some refer to as my kind of danger or my panic zone. And I'm sort of like, I might be task switching. I might be, trying to do too many things at once. I might get overwhelmed with all the things going on around me. I think our sort of real challenge as educators is to keep our students in what gets called in the literature, this zone of proximal development, right? This ZPD, where if they're so balanced, right, they're so comfortable, they're bored, they're going to sleep. They already know what you're saying. They already know what you're trying to give them. They're not interested in it. So how do we think about being motivated ourselves and motivating them to attend to what's going on in the classroom? We want not just them to be in a zone of proximal development where they're slightly, but not too uncomfortable. We also want that in ourselves. So I'm going to introduce that as a sort of goal and a purpose why I'm going to suggest the things I'm about to suggest for you, which may in some ways feel uncomfortable as an educator and somebody in charge of the spaces that you're in, like a classroom. A lot of this comes from prior work by David Kolb, where he describes an experiential learning cycle where first we plan, we're going to do something, then we try to do it and we succeed and fail, and then we figure out what works and we sort of get this concrete measure of doing. I'm now going to give the lecture in this way. I'm now going to give the assignment in this way. We sort of rinse and repeat and continue to do. And maybe, not always, right, there's this opportunity to reflect on, how am I doing this? How does this go? What does this mean? There's a lot to dig into there. I'm just going to jump over it quickly and say that I've thought about this from a group perspective as well as a facilitation perspective. As a teacher, how do I facilitate a group to do this stuff? And what does that mean? It means that I'm thinking about and I'm giving the opportunity for others to engage in identifying the purpose of what we're doing. Why are we here and why does it matter? I'm taking that time to facilitate and provide an opportunity for the people that I'm facilitating to build and participate, contribute to norms, the habits that we're going to engage in, the routines of the day. How does that look? Is it in my comfort zone or am I trying new norms? Am I giving them the opportunity to try new norms, etc.? I'm thinking about the goals, which is different than purpose. A lot of us think the goal is the purpose. The purpose is why I'm doing something, why it matters. The goal is simply what I'm doing. Sort of like the objectives, right, of a class, the learning objectives for a particular class versus the sort of, this is why the class exists. This is why it's important to learn about attention. This is what we're going to do to learn about attention. So when we think about what our students are doing, what they're doing while they're doing what they're doing, how do we invite them in to shaping that conversation? We're going to talk a little bit about that. And finally, how do we invite students to contribute to making meaning in the classroom for themselves, for the class, for the world? What does that mean? And are we serious about it? Are we really inviting people to reflect on what our experiences mean? I'm positing these 4 things to you as the most motivationally attentive ideas that we can put forward in the classroom. All of these things like necessarily circle around what the class is about. So you notice I haven't mentioned like, this is how I teach English, or this is how I teach psychology, or this is how I teach. All of these things can be done around the thing that we're doing, and in fact are already going on around the thing we're doing. The question is, are we inviting students to be a part of that process? So I'm going to give some ideas how to invite them. These are certain stages that groups might go through. Again, more information in the paper, but we're going to leave that to the side for a moment. The questions to be asking really for us are, how do my students help answer why this class matters? Why does this class matter? And how do they help me decide why this class matters? How do my students help decide how this class acts? What does the day look like? What does the semester look like? How do they get to engage in deciding that? Do they know that the conversation's open to them? They're having an effect on it. How are they having an effect on it? How do my students help define what this class does? And who does it? What do the assignments look like? Who's responsible for them? And finally, how does my class help define what this class means to them or what it means to the world? And these are important things. I'm going to go through each of these and I'm going to try to, spin some ideas. I'm going to deepen what I'm talking about here, but I'm also going to then provide ideas as to how do I accomplish this in my class. So first, a little bit more on just ideas to try, but a little abstractly. What does it mean to try to do each of these things? I'm suggesting have students tell you and each other, why are they taking this course? Do they ever have the opportunity? Have they ever been asked? Do you ever say, and I'll talk about, but first day, this is the biggest thing we're talking about. What we start with the why, because that grabs attention. It grabs my attention because now I know where everybody's coming from. It grabs their attention because they're like, this guy actually cares what I think about, not just that I showed up and I'm converting oxygen to carbon dioxide in their presence. Why are they studying this topic? Why does psychology matter? And why take psychology instead of English, instead of Spanish, instead of engineering? Why this? Why did they come to class today? On a day-by-day basis, why did they come to class today? Are they proud of themselves for coming to class today because they overwhelmed all of the other challenges they were experiencing today in order to make it to class? Give them a moment to stand on that rock, right? And be proud of that. That's valuable. That gets their attention. That gets their buy-in motivationally. Try to have students contribute. Try to have students contribute to a whole lot of ways in which we work through the class. How does the class get started? How does it finish? Do you say every day we're going to start with this and every day we're going to end with that? do they get to decide how that goes? Do they have an opportunity to engage in a conversation or give you ideas for how that might work? How do students contribute to the class's values? Are there explicitly stated values for the class that students can latch onto and say, this is an example of this value in this course and how it comes out? Putting these things together helps deepen that well of like, why am I selecting, remember Valerie's presentation, this thing versus that thing, right? What to pay attention to, the things the class values. Do I have access to those values or are they being told to me? Am I put in a state of boredom or overwhelm? It's when I get to engage that I'm there. Scarily, for many of us, how and when assignments or deadlines are completed. Oh no, they can't decide this. They can't, then I'm not being this or that, right? And to think beyond that frame for a moment, consider the motivation and the things we attend to that we have power over and that we get to decide compared to those that we don't. And I would suggest that giving students this opportunity to have some amount, not unlimited, of course, but some amount of power over how and when assignments are completed gives them that opportunity to attend on a deeper level. Have students name and choose content for the course. I want to learn about this. I took this class because this is what I want to learn about. Can we learn about this? Sure, bring it to us. That's something, that's a day that student's going to attend to. Have students name and choose formats for assignments, their role, right, in those assignments. Name and choose how they're feeling that day, what their goals are for that day. I'm here to convert oxygen to carbon dioxide. That's what I'm here to do. I can't handle anything else, but I'm proud of myself for making it here today. And let that be enough on some days, right? Because we all have those days. Have them name it, have them recognize it. That gives them the opportunity to let go of all those other things their attention's being divided by and say, I'm going to acknowledge that, and now I'm going to let it go. I'm going to emotionally be here. Finally, give students opportunities to discuss what the content means to them. Often we spend the whole time saying, this is what the content means, right? And they don't ever have this opportunity to be like, oh, this is how I understand what you're saying. We assume they understand what we're saying, and they assume they understand what we're saying. Even more dangerous. They walk out with this idea, I've got it. They tell somebody else about it, they don't got it, right? We overhear it in the hallway. That's not what I said. Yeah. Give them this opportunity to discuss and to say out loud and to say to them in different ways. I do this with them. I will get to that. But how do they get the opportunity to discuss what the content means to them and their life? How do they get the opportunity to discuss what they used to think something meant and how that changed? And how do they get an opportunity to change your mind about what content means? How often are you willing, are we willing as instructors to learn what they have to teach us, what they've found from the world? These are complex topics that we're responsible for, and they change all the time. We're always learning. Are we engaging in that learning process or taking some responsibility for some closed off room that doesn't engage in learning anymore, that only learns what people learn in that room? Is that room learning? Is a deeper question. That's a thing to attend to. That's a thing that's interesting. That's a thing that motivates me. This room feels like the walls are learning. Wow. Right? Okay, so what do? I use name tense because I think that hearing people's names, that is the sweetest sound to our brains, and there's good data on this. But in addition to that, I have them create name tents. They write their name on a folded piece of paper and they put down a tent on their desk. And on the back of it, I have them write 3 responses to why they're taking this course. On the first day, I take up the name tents, I give them back so that every day I'm seeing their name and they're seeing their purpose for being there. I have them introduce, I introduce myself and I have them introduce themselves, and I introduce researchers that I'm talking about with why rather than what. What do I mean by that? Instead of saying this person studies this person studies that, this person found this person found, these are all whats. I introduce myself as why I care about the research I'm doing, why this person is interested in this task. And they say it in their bio, right? And we can include this information to give people an idea of motivation. That gives me something to attend to. What's the direction of this narrative you're telling me? Why does this what matter? Including why information rather than only what is really valuable. I create full value agreements with my students. What does this mean? It means that picture a Pinterest board, picture a Jamboard, picture a Google Doc, picture any kind of collaborative space you'd like. Many, many tools will work for this, where students get to anonymously publish values they have for the course. They have for classes, they have for classmates, they have for the ways that they want things to go. And there are many different prompts for this. If you use this term in Google, it'll give you a million different ways to prompt this activity. What is a full value agreement and how can you start this from the beginning? I let students request how they're going to do things. I have this idea of a concept map that we complete in class of the lecture, of the discussion, whatever happens to have happened that day. And the concept map is a blank sheet of paper. If they want to write out words to me, great. If they want to draw pictures, amazing. I had somebody who was basically sketching artwork that belongs in a gallery last year. And it was, to them, it was meaningful for the lecture's topic. It helped them place an image in their mind. I'm waiting for a student to like fold it into an origami shape or rip it up into some kind of, you know, I mean, like the paper is theirs. You do what you're going to do with it. When it gets to the presentation, I tell them, you want to use slides? Use slides. You want to sing a song? Sing a song. Tell us about this topic that we're studying in memory and attention, and you figure out the way to get us interested and engaged in it. What's the modality? That's up to you. You tell me what modality works best for you. I'll do my best. I'm not perfect. None of us has all the time in the world. Let's recognize that. Let's get some buy-in from them. You think videos will be better. I would love that idea. Give me a video so I can share it with the class. So I can share it with future classes. Why not? I have, this is along a similar theme, but students generate course and lecture content. They send me articles. That's one of the tasks that they thought. They send me articles they want discussed. They give me an opportunity to learn about what's going on. Again, this is about making ourselves uncomfortable as well to gain attention. I'm going to start speeding up a little bit because we're definitely running out of time. What can we do to ungrade assignments or to choose your mode for those assignments? Similar to this idea of requested modalities, but for them, I set a goal that they need to do this. They show up having done it in some mode. I take breaks in the middle of lectures, whether it's with Mentimeter or, and I love like this kind of, you know, like they can be on their device. They don't need a laptop, like a Google Doc or whatever, but this sort of thing where, you know, they can just sort of send in something and we talk about where they're at, where their head's at in the middle of what I'm talking about, or I have them pair and share with each other to then share out with the course. And I have them reflect on what all these things are that I tell them go out and read. And then the idea is they come back and I tell them about the reading. Like, no, you tell me about what the reading means to you. And then let's talk about it in class, how that meaning changed, right? These sorts of pre-work that are active rather than passive helps motivate them and their attention to attend to us. Okay, and finally, change my mind challenges. I think it's this way, change my mind about it. I dare you. Right? But it lets them know, it sends the message that I'm willing to engage if they are. So I'm just going to leave these questions up one more time. These are the sort of guiding lights that I use to think about how do I include students in this process so that we're both sitting in that green zone rather than the blue or the dark blue. And I'll finish there and thank you all for your attention.